Juliet Schor, you are an economist, a sociology professor at Boston College, and you have written many books about work-time balance, consumerism, economic inequality, and the environment. And today we're talking about your latest book, After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Get It Back. Juliet, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here.
So, Juliet, my first question, I saw your CV, I saw all your accomplishments, and I got dizzy because she just, I went to the Amazon page and I had to scroll down several times to see all the books that you have written. So I wonder if you could give us a sense of your background. First of all, when you went to school, what is it that you were planning to do with the rest of your life?
Well, actually, when I went to school, I was not planning to be a professor. I wanted to be an activist, a social justice activist. We called it something different in those days, but I was, from an early age, I was involved with issues of labor exploitation. My first cause was the United Farm Workers and the mistreatment that farm workers were getting in the United States, anti-war, ecological issues. So feminism, all those things of the 60s and 70s. But when I got to graduate school, I got pulled in, I think, by the intellectual issues. But I've always had a very activist side to me as well. Um, so I was studying issues of labor, and that got me into also studying consumption. Why is it that people get locked into jobs when they might prefer, to get out of them? And then the ecological consequences of our extremely consumerist lifestyle. And, one thing leads to another.
And what was it about you that drove you towards this field, activism? I mean, most people they spend a lot of money or earn a lot of money. So activism, is something that I see more and more every day, but it's not like the mainstream thing that people would like to do for the rest of their life.
Yeah. So I think it was partly the times. I was, from uh, early my preteen years even was going to anti-war demonstrations.
Right.
But for me, there was another thing, which is my parents had been activists. And then I didn't know that when I was growing up, but somehow it was transmitted to me through a very, unconscious process, I think. But they were both very involved in political activities, both my parents. So I guess I picked it up from them. I also come from a culture, New York Jewish. A lot of people in that community were very socially active for many decades before I was born, and also, to this time.
Well, okay, and then slowly somehow you got dragged into academia. How did that happen, or what created that shift?
Well, I never intended it.
Right.
Uh,
Okay.
I graduated college very young. I was 19. I thought, okay, I'll just keep going to school because I need to learn to be a better activist. I think, if you're kind of good at it in graduate school, your professors try and get you to do what they did. And that's sort of, it just happens. For me, it just happened. I went into graduate school saying, I'm not going to be a professor. I just want to learn more. And I came out of it a professor. So it's,
Okay,
it's,
so
it's just the going with the flow, I suppose. I don't regret it. Because, I've been able to do a lot of activism even as an academic.
okay, so I see in your education you have economy and sociology. So which side do you do you start working on?
So I was an economist from the
Okay.
beginning. I got my PhD in economics. I spent the first half of my career as an economics professor. Um, in when I left Harvard to go to Boston College, I switched into sociology. My work had changed a lot, and also economics had changed in ways that made it harder and harder to be someone like me who's more critical on the left,
Mm.
not agreeing with a lot of the economic dogma. Sociology was a place that is much more open intellectually, so I felt more at home there. And I'd been studying consumption, which is much more in the orbit of sociology these days than economics. So it was a kind of gradual and natural transition. But this new book, After the Gig, is really a combination because it's about labor and, labor markets and what's happening to people in their work experience. And so that brings in a lot of economics. I did labor economics. That was one of my areas. So for me, I don't separate them. I kind of, you know, come to the topic with both of those perspectives in mind.
And at what moment in your career you decided to become a writer? Because I saw in Amazon you have, I don't know, many books. So it's been a long time since you've been writing. I saw some of the titles. Can you tell us, first of all, what made you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to start writing books? And then also, can you tell us some of the titles of the books that you have written?
Yeah. So from pretty early on, I was interested in writing for a popular audience. So even before I went to graduate school, I was part of a magazine called Dollars and Cents that does what we called popular economics. In graduate school, I started a school called the Center for Popular Economics, where we took economic ideas, made them easy for ordinary people, got rid of the jargon, didn't use the math too much. And so I had started writing popular articles early on. Um, this was also something that my professors, I think, because of them, I got into it. So I'd started, my first book was called The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure. It was a bestseller, it made a big splash, but my advisors had written a book that was also a very popular, made a big splash. And so I had that model in front of me, and their editor came to me and said, would you be interested in writing a book? Um, and I said, sure. Um, and and that was the topic that I was working on, and he thought that was a good topic. There's a funny, but a story that I've rarely told it, but at that time I was teaching at Harvard. One of the retired faculty there was a very famous economist named John Kenneth Galbraith. Probably a lot of people know of him. He was also the ambassador to India and a big government official. And Galbraith had written lots of popular books. So I wrote this book when I was still an assistant professor. And I wasn't given tenure at Harvard, which didn't surprise me. I never expected. And Galbraith would always say to me afterwards, you should have written that book after you got tenure. Because to write a popular book in those days didn't necessarily help you
I
uh,
see.
at a place like Harvard. Now I think it's a little bit different. I think there's more appreciation and more desire for faculty members to, be out in the public and getting attention and so forth. But and then once I wrote the first one, the idea of just going back to writing for a very small number of people, that
Mm.
just a few academics. I mean, I'd never really wanted to do that, but it got much less appealing. So I have written books all along. Sometimes I still write just for academics, and sometimes I do more of that, and sometimes less. But I always have that other side of my work, which is trying to get the work out to a broad audience.
Okay, then we get to this book, After the Gig. First of all, what inspired you? And secondly, I see that you wrote this book with other students. I forgot seven PhD students as well. So, what was the inspiration, and how did it work out to have seven people working together on the same idea? Because it's a lot of work to coordinate with even with one co-writer. So you are coordinating with seven.
Yeah. So in 2008, just when the financial collapse happened and the recession came, I was writing a book, and it was originally called Plenitude, The New Economics of True Wealth. And it was a model for an individual or a household to live a very different kind of life than kind of chained to a job. And I know this is something that your audience, thinks about a lot, concepts of financial independence and so forth. And a big part of it was to reduce your hours of work, reduce what you need to spend, create more autonomy in your life, get goods and services more inexpensively, maybe barter, maybe produce things for yourself, maybe create a little second side job. You learn how to, do something and make some money from it. And that was the context in which I found out about things like Airbnb and Uber and Lyft, but also nonprofits like food swaps and maker spaces where people were making things for themselves, or time banks where you could get services by trading your time with other people. So that's what got me interested. And after I finished the Plenitude book, I I was approached by the MacArthur Foundation to see if I was interested in doing some research for them. And I said this was what I was interested in. They said, fine. They began to fund me. That's how I got that team of graduate students. And so we worked for 7, 8 years doing all this research on nonprofits and for-profits, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, Uber, Lyft, Postmates, delivery services, and so forth. And the students each typically would take a case. So a couple of platforms or one site. We did a lot of different kinds of research. We did big data research. We did lots and lots of interviews with the people who were earning money on these apps, with the consumers. And so we worked as a team for many years, and it was a really great experience. The book writing itself, I did all myself. We had written a lot of papers together where we really did write them, and we developed a good way to do that. And some of the chapters are coming, very much from those papers that we wrote. But in the end, it's too hard, as you say. It's very hard to write a collective book. I think you get a better writing output, if you have a voice,
Right.
one voice for something like this. So I wrote the book. They all, contributed. They all read it, made comments, and so forth.
Okay, so then let's go to so um, there was a promise of the sharing economy, and then it got hijacked, and you are telling us how to get it back. So, first of all, what was the promise? How did it get hijacked, and how can we get it back?
Okay. So the promise was, I think, first and foremost, on the worker side, the promise was a whole new way to work, that you can work without a boss, that you have tremendous freedom. You work when you want, how you want, as much as you want, as little as you want. So, an incredibly appealing thing to many, many people who work under conditions where they don't control their conditions of work, where they have a boss, where they have a schedule they have to conform to, etc. So that was one big part of the promise. Now there are other parts. It promised, and it also promised good income for those jobs. And it promised easy access. I mean, anybody can sign up for a lot of these platforms with very few restrictions. it promised social benefits. It said that people who were going to be interacting in this new person-to-person, or what we call peer-to-peer economy, were going to make friends with each other, and they were going to have bonds. And instead of the sort of dehumanized corporate interactions, fake interactions, this was going to be real person-to-person connection, individual people helping other people. You need a place to stay when you're traveling, you can stay in my place, Airbnb. I'm driving somewhere, you need a ride, let you come with me. Ride, what used to be called ride sharing. So
Right.
that was the idea. So it was very personal. And then the third idea was I was going to solve the climate crisis because we weren't going to build hotels anymore, and people were going to give up their cars because they could just get a ride in somebody else's car and so forth. So those were the promises. It didn't work out as expected. Now, on the work side, the story's kind of interesting because for some people, it there has been a really good aspect to it, which is if you don't rely on that platform income for your basic expenses, what we found is you're a lot happier with the situation. So you're a retiree, you just want to make a little bit of extra money driving for Uber or Lyft. You uh, you have a job, your partner has a job, but maybe you have some student loans you need to pay down, or maybe you're saving for something, or maybe it's just getting a little bit harder to make your mortgage payment. You rent out that room. So for those people, mostly good. The people who need to make a living on the platform, who don't have another source of income, have had a really tough time. You don't have any benefits. You don't have any guarantees. You can go out there as a ride hail driver and make $6 an hour after you, uh, or maybe less if there's no work. You may spend a third of your time waiting around for rides, as we find is what the data shows in some cities. And all the expenses are on you. And a lot of ride hail drivers took on debt. And Uber and Lyft kept squeezing the rates, lowering, lowering, lowering. So it started out really nicely. The wages were good, the conditions were good, but over time it really deteriorated. And the simple answer for that is the greed of the companies. They just
Mm.
kept squeezing the workers. Not every company, there are some differences. Ride hail has been the worst. Deliveries, also somewhat kind of probably second in terms of bad treatment of the workers. How do we win it back? Well, there are two big things that are happening. One is regulate the companies. And starting in 2018, that started to happen. New York put a minimum wage in for drivers. It put a cap on the number of drivers, because part of the problem with some of these platforms is anybody can join. So too many people join and there's not enough work for people. So
Right.
those people who are professional drivers who've been doing it for years and years, suddenly everybody's coming out of the woodwork to get work on the platform, and they're losing their livelihood. Seattle City Council just voted to put in a minimum wage for drivers, which is the New York. It's about $17 an hour after expenses, so about I think 27 before expenses. They have to make 17 after, accounting for the depreciation, the gas, the insurance, etc. So regulation is really important. In California, there's a big fight over whether ride-hail drivers should be classified as employees and guaranteed getting minimum wage, workers' comp, unemployment. And the other thing that is really interesting that I've been studying is platforms that are owned by the workers. They're called platform co-ops. I think there are quite a few starting in Quebec, where you are. I know there was a big ride hail co-op, and I'm
There's one
forgetting the
called
name of it.
Eva. There's one
Yes,
called
AVA,
Eva. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. Yes, I've met some of the founders, and with the platform co-ops, the workers own the platform. They get much more of the profits. They also are able to put uh, the work rules in place that are fair. One of the problems of ride-hail platforms and delivery platforms is there's a lot of unfair deactivation or firing of workers, and a lot of complaints from workers about that. And so in a worker co-op, the rules are fair and transparent. So those are the two things that are happening now. Of course, the regulation affects many, many more people. Co-ops are small, but there's something that's really growing.
Let me share with you. At one time, I was an Uber driver myself, and I had a strategy. I was one of those who really didn't need the job to survive, and I only worked 2 hours a day, which were the peak hours. I worked from 8 to 10, and that time the peak it was always times two. So in those 2 hours, I earned maybe the equivalent of half of 4 hours, because everyone wants to go has to get to work at 9 o'clock, and there were not enough Uber drivers in the whole city to satisfy the whole demand. So then of course the price got beat up, and it was very rare the occasion that I didn't get pay twice the regular rate. And of course, by 10 o'clock, it was completely dead. There was no sense of being outside on a car. So, like around 10 o'clock, I drove my last passenger and I came back home. And if I was having a month that I needed extra money, then I would work the shift from 4:30 to 6:30, which is when people get out of work, and then that is also busy, but not as busy as the time period. But at that time, and I got over it because I got bored. Yes, it was exciting the first year, and then I got bored of it, and also I started getting back problem, because sitting down for a couple of hours is tough on the body. But overall, maybe because I guess I was in that category of the people who were doing well, and I didn't really need the money to survive. And my experience was quite positive. And at that time, if someone would have told me, "Oh, we're gonna give you a regular hours and minimum wage or whatever," I would say, "No, I'm just happy working my 2 hours a job a day. I don't want any regulation, or I don't want to having to show up on a Tuesday if I don't want to, for example." So yeah, so I can see that some people were satisfied. On the other hand, those who need to earn more and who are out there at 10 o'clock when there is no traffic, their pay, I mean, if you consider pay, is less than minimum wage, of course. So I guess there had to also be, I mean, the driver or the person who is doing the task has to kind of sense the market as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
if you're working 12 hours a day, you're working a lot of dead hours, and of course your average per hour rate is just horrible.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happened. But one thing that's happened is over time, especially in those big cities, well, as we know about it in the big cities, have some of the really intensive data collection. Um, a growing fraction of the work is being done by full timers, and those people are working 10, 12 hour days. Their backs are really bad,
Right.
and it's become really, really, really difficult for them because the wages are so low. They're sleeping in their cars. They're in debt. They can't support their families. They're just locked into a pretty miserable
Right.
situation. Whereas your situation is the ideal one, um, and you could work when there's a high wage,
Right.
and not when there isn't. And that's exactly what we found across many platforms, that the people who have choice about whether to take the tasks are able to take the high, whether it's drive at a certain time or on the task based. We studied task based platforms like Task Rabbit, where you bid for tasks, or um, Instacart is another one where you bid for jobs. The people who have the choice to take it or leave it, have a much better situation. They also don't have to go into risky situations. They can
Right.
avoid anything that feels like a little bit of a problem. So very different experiences for workers who are differently situated. And this is something that's, unique about platforms, because in most jobs, the kinds of people who hold them are much more similar, because the companies set hours. So you can't just choose your hours in most jobs. It's either a full-time job or a
Right.
part-time job, or so people generally are in the same situation with respect to how much they're depending on that income, but not on a platform where you can have a person who works 1 hour a month, or, you know,
Right.
uh, hundreds of hours a month.
So the idea to get it back is through regulation. Now the thing about it is that when you talk about regulation, you are thinking about the United States, or maybe, or well, no, never mind. I take that back because I see a lot of regulations coming out of Europe as well. But these companies are international. I mean, we have India, we have China, we have, I don't know, so many in my country. I'm from Colombia, South America. There is Uber, and there is no regulation there. So I guess to get the sharing economy back through regulation, it will be an arduous city by city, country by country, that could probably take a long time. Is that right?
Yeah. So that is an issue, because uh, a lot of these services are very local, and they're locally regulated. Sometimes countries have just banned Uber, like Hungary, I think. Germany, it was pretty much banned for a long time. Um, but you're right that it is a patchwork. And much harder in the global south, where you have much more unregulated labor markets in
Right.
general, large numbers of people in the informal sector. I have a graduate student studying gig labor in India. I have colleagues studying in global south cities around, on all the continents, except Antarctica. But, so regulation is difficult in that way. On the other hand, it's there may be some possibility, if a company makes a change in one country, that they might also decide
Mm.
to do more. And you're starting to see a little bit of cross country uh, worker organizing. So that's what there was a global strike of Uber drivers last May. Now, it wasn't a huge strike, but it was the beginnings of an international movement.
Wow.
So, and you also have um, an alliance of cities from countries around the world who come together every year to try and share what they're doing and so forth. So there are some things happening at the global level that could maybe translate to more rapid change than just city by city.
Okay, and my last question. Now we are in the midst of a pandemic, and also we have, with all the means of communications that we have companies that can, get a worker in Philippines to do this, and then a programmer in Serbia, and then I don't know, a marketer in New York to put all this together. Do you think that the gig economy will be eventually the way of the future? Everyone will be working on a gig per week, gig per gig basis, or that the structure of the 9 to 5 will prevail?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the no, no, yes, yes. The not everyone is going to work on gigs. I think people have really overstated how much this model will scale. Um, Part of it is that gigs work for discrete types of work where it's an individual doing the work. It's all individual based. So whenever you have a community, collective production, if you're in a factory making lots of people making something together, you need to have a
Mm.
coordinated production. You can't,
Right.
it's hard to organize it by a gig. I mean, you could gigify a little bit, but you also need, it's a different kind of production process. If you think of agriculture, it's quite different. That said, there is gigification or going on. You're seeing it in professions now more. So it's going on across the labor market. So there will be more and more of it. I don't think it will become the only thing. But you're also going to see a push back because the current structure of gig labor is that it's very, very insecure because you don't have regular income, you don't have unemployment insurance, you don't have minimum. So it's very likely that the pushback is going to create some kind of structure of security. And, we're debating this on a much larger framework as societies, many societies. Is there going to be a universal basic income, or is there going to be a job guarantee, or the governments are going to have to step in to do something to provide some level of security. I should say have to. If they don't, it's going to be a disaster, particularly as we have climate change creating more and more disruption in our societies. The push to create some basic level of security needs to be there in every country, and maybe eventually at a global level. Once you have that, gig work is a lot more appealing because it does give you that freedom, but without, that you have a net underneath you.
Right.
Rather than something where you can really just fall into destitution so easily.
Okay, Juliet, I wonder if there's any question that I neglected to ask you. I think I asked you about the content of the book, and I'm quite satisfied with the response. So, but I always miss asking about that thing that I never ask about. So, is there something that I neglected to ask you?
No, nothing that you neglected to ask, but I will say one thing, which is that you mentioned to me that many in your audience are interested in financial independence.
Right.
And back in the 1990s, I co-founded an organization with someone named Vicki Robin, who you may know.
Our hero.
An early, very earliest person working on financial independence, and it was called the Center for a New American Dream. And it was all about living differently and working differently and living differently and so forth. So it's really lovely to be able to speak to you and your audience today. And I think that so much of what, although I don't, my work isn't specifically in that financial independence box in a narrow way. It's everything that I've worked on for many years is very relevant to creating a different way to live that gives people a lot more freedom and a lot more independence from the corporate grind and the rat race.
Right, perfect. Juliet, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you if they decide to see what you are up to?
Yeah, thank you. So it's After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. It should be in bookstores and online pretty much everywhere. It's published by University of California Press. And I'm only active on one platform. It's Twitter, and I'm at Juliet Schor, JulietSchor.
Juliet, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.